So, today on the podcast, part 2 of our story about Walt Disney and the evolution of color. In the first part, Herbert Kalmus and Dan Comstock developed an experimental process to create color movie presentations using only black and white film. The filming process involved using colored filters inside the camera to create black and white records of colored light. When we last left off, the Kalmus team was focused on creating a film in Florida to capitalize on the bright light there, to demonstrate their new process. This process wasn't full color, but rather limited color that presented reds, yellows, and greens, though left blues and purples out of the mix. To have full color using black and white film and colored filters, a camera would need to have at least 3 film records. One with a red filter, another with a yellow, and a third with a blue. But in 1916, 3 identical film records was simply beyond the ability of these young inventors. 2 filtered records with limited but precise color they believed would cause enough of a stir in the young film community to interest producers in color presentations, so long as their test project was well received. Eventually, the success of the Kalmus process, or what would soon be called the Technicolor process number 1, would in part rely on Disney animation. But at the time that Kalmus and Comstock were starting out, Walt was still a teenager, living with his parents in Kansas City, where he took art classes on the weekend, classes that taught him basic skills of drawing, cartooning, and caricature, though in the years ahead, the success of Disney would in part rely on Herbert Kalmus, and the success of Herbert Kalmus's company would also rely in part on Walt. And so now, if you're up to speed, let's go. In terms of creating a test film, something that the Technicolor company would present to the world, the initial plan involved Kalmus and Comstock remaining in Boston while Burt Westcott, the team's mechanical engineer, managed film processing on-site in Florida. In Florida, the Technicolor team would have a director, professional actors, and a crew who had worked on other film projects. They would also use a script created by a professional writer focused on the life of a young girl who grew up with outlaw sailors, essentially smugglers. The production had all of the elements necessary to create a captivating screen story for an audience in the mid-19-teens. A company release announced, Technicolor Films is a new brand soon to be offered to the public which will show motion pictures in actual natural colors, not hand-colored or tinted or toned, but reproductions of nature's own grandeur. The first Technicolor production is presently in the making at Jacksonville, Florida, and will be ready for showing to the public early in the year. It will be 8 reels and is probably to be titled The Little Skipper. On December 3, 1916, the Technicolor Portable Railway Lab, fully stocked with equipment and processing chemicals, left for Jacksonville. It was parked on the tracks beside an ice and coal plant. A few days later, a small group from the Technicolor team, led by Westcott, traveled by rail to Florida. Of all the equipment in their possession, the camera was deemed the most important, as it was the only working color camera the company owned. During the trip from New York to Jacksonville, one participant would later recall, the camera was put in a lower berth and strapped in securely so nothing would happen to it. If there had been a shortage of berths on the Pullman sleeping car, the camera would have been given preference over any member of the company. Film tests began a few days before Christmas, but immediately the Technicolor team discovered that processing in a rail car would be more difficult than in a traditional lab. In a traditional lab, they had used glass tubing in the dyeing vat, but to account for the movement of the lab over rails, they had installed tin tubing. Elements from the tin combined with the dyeing chemicals left a foggy sheen on the finished film. Likewise, in Boston, they had sourced pure chemicals for superior results, but now in Jacksonville, they found that hydrogen peroxide, locally acquired, contained impurities. Preparations in the lab took longer than expected, with Westcott fixing one problem only to discover another. When he finally decided that the situation was ultimately beyond his ability, he asked Dan Comstock to come down to Florida. "Well, I remember vividly when they called me," Comstock would later recount. "They said, if you can get things going in 2 days to a week, we'll go on. Otherwise, we'll have to close up." When Comstock arrived, one by one, they worked through the issues, while the cast and crew grew restless, and production funds slowly slipped away. By the time shooting began in mid-January, the team was confident that they could produce compelling color records on black and white film that, when finished, would create a spectacle on screen, even if that spectacle cost more than they had initially anticipated. The film was now called The Gulf Between, meaning not only the gulf between land and sea, but also the social gulf between the film's two lovers, one from a respectable home and one who had grown up with smugglers. The gulf between was also an apt way to describe the difference between the expectations and execution of the first Technicolor feature. Principal shooting continued for over 4 months, far longer than planned. That summer, the film was edited, titled, and finished. Around this time, people started to refer to Kalmus as the Doctor, a tall, refined man who, despite his damaged finger, could still play the piano, favoring classical music and duets. Not far from his Boston office, on September 13, 1917, Kalmus, or the Doctor, offered a preview screening of his film at a local Baptist church called the Tremont Temple, largely for supporters, local reporters, and those who had worked on the project. The Boston press was particularly kind in its review of the film, focusing on its technical merits, such as the beauty of the flesh tones and hair. Particularly striking was the reddish-brown coat of a bay horse, one reviewer noted. The truthfully represented colors of a newspaper comic supplement, the tones of draperies, rugs, paint, glass, and clothing. But the real test here, Kalmus knew, would be a screening in the big city to the south. Kalmus arranged to premiere his film on September 21, 1917, in Aeolian Hall in New York City, before an audience of critics, studio executives, and most importantly, potential investors. Aeolian was technically a concert hall in Midtown, owned by a piano company, but it held over 1,000 seats. With the Boston preview behind him, he felt reasonably confident that the screening in New York would be a triumph. In the booth, manning the twin synchronized projectors, was Dan Comstock and one of his assistants, ready to handle any problem. Shortly before the festivities, Kalmus brought a small group up to the projection room to show them the Technicolor system. He took pride in explaining the twin units and even demonstrated how to adjust the equipment. As the audience settled into their seats, Kalmus walked to a podium centered on the stage. There, he explained that until now, color had been an imprecise science. It was not unusual for a horse to appear to have two tails, one red and one green, or for color fringes to wash across the screen whenever there was rapid movement across the lens. He looked out at the audience, finding men mostly in dark suits. The Technicolor innovation, he continued, was in making two simultaneous exposures through a single lens, producing geometrically identical pictures and no fringes. He continued to discuss other elements of their color process, the use of prisms, also the procedure to sensitize the film. He explained that up in the booth, the Technicolor image was created from the projection of paired images from two projectors, not just one. But as the film finally blossomed up on the screen, he observed the twin color images were slightly out of alignment. Something happened to the adjusting element in the projector, he later explained. In spite of frantic efforts on the part of the projectionists, the filter refused to adjust. We were displaying fringes whiter than anybody had ever seen before. It was a disaster. After months of working on the film and years of development on the system, all Kalmus could do now was stand there as Comstock tried to adjust the projectors and as images doubled on the screen. After the show, Kalmus confessed, Dan and I hastened back to our room at the Belmont Hotel, where we attempted to say what we could to one another in the way of consolation, although we were in the depths of despair. I couldn't blame him for the catastrophe, and even if I could, I would not, for he already felt as badly about the incident as it was possible to feel. The two men would later wonder if the demonstration of the projection equipment before the performance had contributed to their problems. Despite a less than perfect presentation, the press was kind to Technicolor, pointing out the future possibilities for this inventive new process. But following the debacle in New York, Kalmus and Comstock knew two important things about their Technicolor system. First, their film capture system, with the camera creating two geometrical identical color records, showed promise but wasn't perfect. And second, their projection concept would need to be entirely redone. Kalmus would eventually admit that any operator who projected a film on a twin projector system as complex and delicate as theirs would have to be a cross between a college professor and an acrobat. Kalmus scheduled one more public presentation of their equipment, this time at the Claw and Ellinger Theater in Buffalo, New York. But there, too, as he would later recall, there was a decided gulf between what we promised in the lecture and what the customers saw on the screen. Coolidge, as an investor, could see the potential in color movies, but by this point he and his friends had sunk over $300,000 into a technology that didn't yet work. More so than Kalmus, he understood that the road to a viable color process would be a long one. This is pretty big for Boston, he told Kalmus one afternoon. You better go to New York for financing. In the months that followed, Kalmus and Comstock found additional investors to support their research. With the new money, they redesigned the Technicolor camera with some assistance from the Ackley Camera Company. For the new camera, they had three goals: to increase the light that passed into the camera via the lens, to deepen the image precision between the two color records, and to move from an additive color system using two color filters to a subtractive color system also using two color filters, as they believed that would improve color quality on a white movie screen. An additive system added color to the projected light to create colored images on the screen. A subtractive system, though, removed color waves from light to produce targeted colors on the screen. In short, the three primary colors in an additive system, red, blue, green, combined to produce white. But as white was already part of the screen, a clear section of film could easily produce white on its own. The three primary colors of a subtractive system, cyan, magenta, and yellow, combined to produce black or near black, essentially removing all the light, which was a more useful shade when projecting colors onto a white surface. Beyond the camera, Kalmus and Comstock also completely reconceptualized the projection process. Originally, they had believed that the two-color records could be projected from synchronized projectors, with the paired images combined up on the screen. But now they realized that this could only work under ideal circumstances and with a highly trained engineer in the projection booth. Kalmus insisted that they must do away with special projectors. Instead, they looked to combine the two-color records onto a single strip of film. This was accomplished by cementing the two film records back-to-back on specially prepared strips of film that had little depth. One side of the cemented film would be tinted with a reddish-orange dye, the other with green. They also began to experiment with a relief dyeing process in which raised areas of the film were dyed, leaving the recessed areas uncolored, thereby managing color saturation. With this process, the two dyed colored film strips back to back produced a limited color image on a single strip of film. In theory, assuming the combined film was flexible enough, it could be shown on any projector in the country without the need for filters or any extra equipment. Kalmus and Comstock also realized that to make this process viable for commercial studios, they would need to minimize the labor costs in processing and printing the film. At a pilot lab in Boston, they developed a machine to seamlessly cement together the red and green color records back to back to make a continuous double image strip of film. They also invented another machine to dye the film 20 feet at a time, one side with a red tone dye, the other with green, without either dye bleeding onto the opposite side of the film. Despite ongoing outside investment, Kalmus might have been forced to give up his dream of a reliable color process if he had focused solely on this one project. He'd had the foresight, however, to explore other inventions during these same years. He continued his work with artificial abrasives and worked with a local slaughterhouse to better manage animal byproducts. And more importantly, the diversity of income sources gave Kalmus a unique position among young companies looking to develop a reliable color film process. Whereas other companies wholly focused on color accepted bankruptcy, Kalmus was able to pursue color over years because it wasn't his only source of income. By 1920, he believed that his color concept was finally coming to fruition. He was now ready to head to Hollywood. That same year, over 1,000 miles from Boston in Kansas City, a young Walt Disney was starting his own animation studio. It began in his father's garage at night, with Walt animating political cartoons after he'd finished his day job at the Kansas City Film Ad Company. He was soon joined by friends, most notably his longtime business partner Ub Iwerks. Walt's efforts in Kansas City under two names, the KC Studio and Laugh-O-Grams Incorporated, would last for 3 years. Then Walt and Ub Iwerks would move to Hollywood, where, with the help of Roy Disney, they would create a new animation company, the Disney Brothers Studio. All three of these men from Kansas City, Walt, Ub, and Roy, along with the emerging field of animation, would eventually play a role in the development of Technicolor. But that part of the story is still a few years in the future. By 1920, Herbert Kalmus, who was more casually known now as the Doctor, was trying to figure out how to sell his new color process to movie studios, something that he was just beginning to call the Technicolor Process Number 2. After some successful tests with both the new equipment and the new process in Boston, the Doctor and the Technicolor team headed to California with the hope of convincing Hollywood to use their new color system to create commercial films. The Technicolor team believed that they might soon be a significant part of the Hollywood system, as they would control the patents on the cameras, manage the processing system, and create all the Technicolor prints. Once in Hollywood, however, they found that studio executives were largely skeptical of color film and saw it mostly as an expensive novelty, one that wouldn't significantly increase ticket sales. As Kalmus recalled, the objections were nearly endless. Too much light was required for color photography. Actors would refuse to work under such intense light. Actors and actresses, for their part, were terrified of a new technology that might not flatter them, indeed might end their careers. And everywhere we heard the complaint, color costs too much. The early 1920s were a difficult time for the fledgling Technicolor company. After a few months in Hollywood, the Doctor understood that studio executives would remain unwilling to purchase this new Technicolor process without proof of its commercial success. With this, he decided to produce a second commercial film to showcase its potential. The film was called The Toll of the Sea, with a story that was modeled after Madame Butterfly. Originally pitched as a two-reel short, it quickly developed into a full-length feature, the first theatrical sample of the new Technicolor method. It premiered on November 26, 1922 at the Rialto Theater in New York. The on-screen results, though not perfect, were superior to other color options, such as Prismacolor. Though the Technicolor print, still using two dyed images instead of the more advantageous three, was unable to produce blues and purples, the colors that it did produce were far closer to nature than any previous on-screen effort, even if some of the colors were slightly grayed out. More problematic, though, the Technicolor print didn't have the same sharpness as a straight black and white print due to the two color records cemented together in such a way that the double-coated images were not quite in the same place. A Technicolor print, however, held far more definition than previous attempts with color. In short, it wasn't perfect, but for 1922, it was quite good. One newspaper reported that the Technicolor team has perfected a process based upon the chromatic optics of color photography by which the colors of nature are reproduced in film. It's likely to prove to be a historical episode in the development of what is now a great industry and may become a great art. The Toll of the Sea was both a critical and financial success, grossing over $250,000 at the box office and returning $165,000 to Technicolor. But it wasn't enough of a financial success to convince most Hollywood executives of the viability of color, especially when Technicolor prints cost 3 times as much as those made in black and white. During these same months, as Technicolor enjoyed some limited success, the Doctor's personal life fell apart. A few months earlier, in 1921, Herbert and Natalie Kalmus had filed for divorce, and now in 1922, the divorce was finalized. For the Doctor, the divorce signaled failure, his inability to create his own family, something for which he had yearned for years. But it also brought a type of relief, as Natalie had been secretive and distant, at times self-centered. For the Doctor, California now represented an opportunity to start over, a chance to remake himself as a newly single man. But then Natalie, his ex-wife, reappeared. According to one family member, Natalie asked Dan Comstock's mother to approach the Doctor with a large request, to ask that Herbert allow Natalie to move out to California and to find a position for her somewhere in the Technicolor company. Mrs. Comstock went on to explain that Natalie had taken sick with a heart condition and that her doctors, giving her only a year or so to live, felt she would be more comfortable in the warm environment of California than back east. Though the Doctor might have said no to Natalie, he couldn't refuse Dan's mother, this woman who had taken him in years ago during college. So the Doctor found himself in the awkward position of pleasing an old friend by taking in his recently divorced wife. With this, he became Natalie's employer. He also helped with her living arrangements. The job he found for her at Technicolor was as a color consultant. Technicolor presently had the ability to produce certain color values. Natalie, with her artistic eye, would help directors select colors in costumes, makeup, and sets that would pair well with those Technicolor could best reproduce on film. In the years that followed, Technicolor experienced modest success, largely with color sequences inserted into otherwise black and white features, a strategy that still rendered color a novelty or a special effect. Among those films that included isolated Technicolor sequences were The 10 Commandments in 1923, Phantom of the Opera in 1925 and Ben-Hur also in 1925. From this period came two more color features, Wanderer of the Wasteland in 1924 and The Black Pirate in 1926, starring Douglas Fairbanks. But color features proved difficult to produce, difficult to distribute. The Technicolor prints, essentially two strips of film cemented together, had a tendency to cup or bend when moving past a hot projector lamp, often throwing the film out of focus. Richard Goldberg, a Technicolor research scientist, recalled, after the finished prints were glued together and dyed on either side, they warped, cupped, and they scratched because they were so thick. There was a lot of trouble, and the company had to replace those prints. Aside from the technical issues, Technicolor faced perception problems. Actresses felt that color might make them look older or less dramatic. Directors thought that color would distract from the narrative, calling attention to the visuals rather than enhancing the story. Producers saw color as an unnecessary expense. Then there was the question of audience, specifically, how an audience would react to sustained color. The argument had been that it would tire and distract the eye, Kalmus was told, take attention from acting and facial expressions, blur and confuse the action. Beyond this, people in the 1920s had come to accept black and white photography as a viable representation of objective reality. Newspapers, magazines, and the screen had for years acculturated its audience to accepting black and white images as an acceptable depiction of the world around them, much in the same way that later generations would view two-dimensional color photographs as an acceptable depiction of the three-dimensional reality in which they actually lived. By 1926, backers had invested $2.5 million in Technicolor, a staggering sum. But still, the company, after a decade, was floundering in development. The doctor understood that the Technicolor process needed to improve in two ways. First, it needed to find some way to essentially print multiple color records on one side of blank film stock. And second, it needed to expand color records to include a full range of color, including blues and purples. In 1928, the same year that sound movies were sweeping the nation, the Technicolor company released Process Number 3. The new application method, Kalmus explained, was essentially two lithographing processes similar to those used by newspapers and magazines, applying colored dye in layers on the same side of the film. The new process substantially improved the sharpness of the projected image and eliminated the problem of warped or cupped film. That same year, syndicated Hollywood columnist Luella Parsons threw her support behind Technicolor, pushing aside many concerns expressed by both stars and studio executives. I should not like to underrate the emotional value of color, she began. I lived on the desert too long not to appreciate the restful qualities of the lavender of the shrubs and the delicate rose and pale blue of the skies. But we cannot advocate color without being sure that the harsh, jarring tones of reds and greens are to be subdued, and the pastel shades will remain in their own class. The Technicolor process has done much to overcome this terrible fear of seeing pink grass and green skies. Dr. Kalmus, who has worked steadfastly in his Hollywood laboratory to prove that he can make our beautiful screen stars even more beautiful, has turned out some really credible short reels based on historical subjects. If this new process continues to catch the delicate fabric of clothes, the sheen of hair, and the texture of skin, there's no reason why it can't be as popular as the talking devices. But perhaps the advent of sound was the event that helped usher Technicolor to some Hollywood studios. For over a decade, Studios hadn't needed to change how they produced pictures, relying on the same cameras, the same lights, the same editing equipment, and the same processing labs. But with an American audience demanding sound, longtime directors and producers were forced to gut studios and upgrade their equipment. By early 1929, Kalmus wrote, all the important studios in Hollywood had become thoroughly sound conscious. This was a great help to us in introducing color. Prior to that, studio executives were loath to permit any change whatsoever in their established method of photography. For a year, perhaps two, there was a color boom in Hollywood, particularly in musicals. Laboratory crews worked 3 8-hour shifts, processing Technicolor negatives and making Technicolor prints. But then, like a novelty that has run its course, the demand for color went away. The doctor believed he understood the problem, that the two-strip process still wasn't able to produce a full range of colors as they appeared in nature. In a May 29, 1929 report to his directors, he explained that the two-color output is not sufficiently good to meet with universal approval. But the problems now may have been cultural. As the Depression covered the nation with a gray blanket of despair, producers moved away from color. Color, it seemed, may have been a novelty, a visual celebration that belonged more fully to bygone years, ones filled with song and good cheer that were now behind them. In 1930, toward the end of the color boom, animation directors such as Walter Lantz were starting to experiment with limited color. Walt Disney, however, was not among them, though one of his associates was. Iwerks, Walt's boyhood collaborator, had recently left the Disney company to start his own animation studio and release a cartoon series called Flip the Frog. Though most of the Flip cartoons would eventually be presented as black and white shorts, in February of 1930, Iwerks announced that the series would be in color from start to finish, with its first color effort already on its way. A new series of 12 cartoons in sound and color are in preparation by Iwerks cartoonist under the auspices of Celebrity Production. Film Daily announced, and will be released at the rate of one a month beginning on or about March 1st. Iwerks' estimation of a March 1st release date for the first Flip cartoon, named Fiddlesticks, was extremely optimistic. It wouldn't find its way into theaters any time in March, nor the month after that. In April, Film Daily asked Walt Disney his opinion about the future of color and animation. I believe that the inclusion of color in the cartoon comedies offers great possibilities for pictorial effects, Walt replied, but would add very little so far as comedy is concerned. There are many problems in sound yet to be worked out, but I should like to see this angle perfected before considering color. After all, in a cartoon comedy, it is laughs and personality that count. Color alone will not sustain public interest unless the cartoon itself is exceptionally clever and unique. A good and clever black and white cartoon should hold its own for some time to come. In short, Walt put forward the idea that sound, particularly music, was the better technology to explore in 1930 compared to the use of color. Singing, dancing characters on screen was of greater value to the Disney effort than scenes arranged with two-strip color. But despite this statement, Walt was clearly interested in color, perhaps because it was now being pursued by his former business partner, an artist who in the late 1920s had once owned 20% of the Disney company. There was a natural sense of competition between Walt Disney and Iwerks. The first Flip cartoon didn't appear until the middle of summer. It was filmed with a two-color strip process with red and green filters. The finished cartoon, impressive for its day, showed a range of colors, but was missing the usual blue and purple spectrum. Those colors up on screen were presented as gray. At the exact same time, Walt released a color-tinted cartoon called Night. Night was part of the musical and artistic explorations that Walt directed toward his Silly Symphonies series. As opposed to a color process, Disney used a film stock tinted blue from edge to edge to give the film both color and mood, much in the way that early German expressionist films had used color. Both Night and Fiddlesticks were released in theaters at the same time, largely in August and September of 1930. Both cartoons were musical adventures. Both cartoons rather oddly featured an extended sequence of a frog skipping across lily pads on the back of a turtle before falling in the river, suggesting that maybe components of the Disney cartoon were discussed before Iwerks struck out on his own. But if there was a clear winner in terms of color presentation, it was the Flip the Frog cartoon produced by Iwerks. Years later, Walt would admit, "I had always been interested in color, but the color of the film at that time was not too good. It hadn't met with too much success in the theaters because there was a certain blurry quality to it. You could try to reproduce something in two colors, you'd have to compromise all the way through." After the color bust of 1930 and 1931, the Doctor was now looking for new ways to monetize Technicolor productions, including training films. As Hollywood returned to black and white for most of its features and shorts, one of his efforts involved surgical studies. The color process, as opposed to black and white, gave a definite impression of the outer skin, muscles, fatty tissues, which was useful in training students at medical schools. It also allowed medical students to have an up-close presentation of surgical procedures instead of standing at the back of a surgical theater. But Kalmus's personal hopes for a larger commercial success rested with the three-strip process, what would later be called Technicolor Process Number 4. In 1939, Technicolor was close to finding a three-strip process, thereby creating the possibility of using all or at least most of the colors seen by the human eye, including blues and purples. One reporter would note in June that the Kalmus team have practically perfected a three-color process. By the start of 1932, the Doctor had much of the equipment and process in place. The difference between this three-component process and the previous two-component process was truly extraordinary, he explained. Not only was the accuracy of the tone and color reproduction greatly improved, but definition was markedly better. With the improved product, however, Kalmus faced multiple problems. First, the three-strip process was expensive. It required a camera to capture 3 colored records on 3 separate strips of film, each chemically sensitized to capture a different segment of the color spectrum. It also required a complicated printing process, in which the 3 color negatives produced 3 separate matrices, each of which worked like a printing plate. With the 3 matrices, color layers could slowly be built up on a blank strip of film. But the matrices, unlike printing plates, had a short lifespan and needed to be replaced after the company made 50 or so prints. Second, Kalmus didn't yet have the ability to process features quickly, nor did he have the ability to create rush prints overnight. Third, and perhaps most significantly, the novelty of live-action color had already passed. Understanding these things, Kalmus looked to animation as a means of premiering the new Technicolor process and hopefully attracting more business. Animation didn't require daily rushes before a director ordered a crew to strike a set. Animation also was short, with an average cartoon running about 7 minutes. Lastly, animation studios were filled with artists trained in painting and drawing, individuals who likely possessed some knowledge of color theory and color harmonies. More so than a live-action director, animators would likely know how to use color in such a way as to express character and mood and thereby create an artful presentation on screen. At first, Kalmus tried to interest some of the East Coast animation studios, but much to his surprise, producers of animation didn't see much value in color, especially a 3-strip color process that would substantially increase the cost of prints. The value, they mostly believed, was in comedy and gags, which could easily be expressed in black and white. With few options available to him, Kalmus looked to this small Disney studio just outside of Hollywood. He believed that Disney might be an ideal match for Technicolor, as Walt was engaged in the scientific art of movies. An appreciation for the equipment and processes that brings images to life, something beyond a mere financial interest in the gate. With this, the fortunes of Herbert Kalmus and Walt Disney were moving closer together. Kalmus needed short, popular films to demonstrate his new full-color process to a mass audience, and Walt needed new ways to elevate his films over that of his rivals, including those films now being produced by his old business partner Ub Iwerks. No one in live action was interested in shouldering the cost of producing a full-length feature with the Technicolor Process No. 4, as it would drastically increase the cost of prints. But perhaps the Disney studio, with its short 7-minute cartoons, might be able to support the cost of a single full-color reel as a way of bringing a larger audience and new interest to the animation that they produced. I'll be back next week to finish this story of how Herbert Kalmus, along with Walt Disney, eventually brings full color to screens across the country. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just 2 things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.